I have stood a lot of posts in my life. Cold ones, long ones, posts where nothing happens for 8 hours and your own heartbeat starts to sound loud in your ears. But there is one night I have never told anyone about. Not properly, not the whole of it. I'm telling it now because I'm old, and because the little girl in this story is grown, and because I think some things shouldn't just die inside a man's chest. So listen. This is the night I broke every rule I was ever given, and I'd do it again. Let me take you back. It was Hollencrest, the autumn of the year the rains came early. If you don't know the place, picture a gray stone kingdom pressed up against a gray stone sea. Old, proud, the kind of place where the weather has moods same as people do. I was a guardsman at Kingsmere Palace, 26 years old, barely 2 years in the uniform, still young enough to think that standing perfectly still was the hardest part of the job. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. Kingsmere wasn't the biggest palace in Hollencrest. It sat on the edge of the capital, half hidden behind a screen of tall black pines, and it had a reputation for being quiet. That's why they sent the child there. I should explain the child. Her name was Princess Leora. She was 9 years old that autumn, though I'd have guessed younger if you'd only seen her from a distance. She was small, thin, the kind of small that comes from not eating properly for a long time. She had dark hair that somebody always kept neat, and a face that never seemed to move much. And she didn't speak. Not to me, not to the staff, not to anyone as far as I could tell. Now, before you get ideas, she could speak. There was nothing wrong with her voice. I heard the doctors say as much, in the low way people say things when they think the guards aren't listening. Guards hear everything, by the way. We're furniture with ears. What had happened was this. The year before, Princess Leora's mother had died. The queen. She'd been sick a long time, and then she wasn't sick anymore, if you understand me, and after the funeral the little girl simply stopped talking, stopped crying too, apparently, which the doctors seemed to think was worse. They had names for it, long names. I don't remember them and I don't want to. All I knew was what I saw. And what I saw was a 9-year-old who walked the halls of Kingsmere like a small ghost, and who had, in all the world, exactly one person left who could make her look up. Her grandmother. The Dowager Queen Adelheid was somewhere past 70 that autumn. A tall old woman, straight-backed even then, with white hair she wore pinned, and a walking cane she used more as a weapon of authority than as a support. When she pointed that cane at you, you moved. But with Leora she was different. I saw it more than once on my rounds. The old woman would sit with the child in the long window seat that looked out over the pines, and she'd talk. Just talk. About nothing. About the birds, about the weather, about people who'd been dead 50 years. And the little princess would sit pressed against her side, silent, but, and this is the thing, listening. You could see her listening. You could see the girl come back into her own eyes when the grandmother spoke. She never answered, but she leaned in. I used to think, watching them, that the old woman was pouring words into the child the way you pour water into a dry pot. Slowly, patiently, trusting that one day it would hold. I liked the Dowager Queen. Everyone at Kingsmere did, in the careful way you like someone you're also a bit afraid of. And I want you to hold on to that picture, the old woman and the silent girl in the window seat, because that autumn it broke. It started with the grandmother's cough. Small thing at first. You'd hear it down the corridor, a dry little sound. The old woman waved it off the way old people do, like coughing was a rumor beneath her dignity to confirm. But it got worse, faster than anyone expected. Within a fortnight the palace physicians were coming and going with their bags and their long faces, and the word fever started drifting through the staff halls, and then a decision was made that I didn't understand at the time and understood too well later. They moved her. The Dowager Queen had an old estate out past the moors, a place called Thornwick, where the air was said to be cleaner, and where a woman could be properly nursed away from the damp of the coast. So they packed her into a carriage on a grey morning and took her out there, an hour and a half's hard road from Kingsmere. And they left the child behind. I don't say it to blame anyone. It was the sensible thing. You don't bring a 9-year-old to a sick room that might be a deathbed. You keep the child safe. You keep the child calm. But I saw Princess Leora's face at the window the morning that carriage rolled out through the pines. I was on the north door. I had a clear view of the drive, and I watched that small figure up in the tall window, both hands flat against the glass, watching the only person left in her world disappear down a wet gray road. She didn't cry. I told you she didn't cry anymore. But she stood there long after the carriage was gone, long after there was anything to see. I stood my post. That was my job. I stood there in my kit and my boots, and I looked straight ahead like I'd been trained, and I told myself it was none of my business, a princess and her grief. I believed that for about 3 more days. Here's a thing about guarding a person. You're not supposed to know them. That's the whole idea. You're a wall. A wall doesn't have opinions about what it's protecting. But I'd been posted near that child for months by then, and a wall that stands near a thing long enough starts to learn its shape. I knew that Princess Leora woke early, because I'd hear the floorboards in her room when I came on for the dawn shift. I knew she wouldn't eat porridge but would eat toast, because I'd hear the staff arguing about it. I knew she kept a wooden horse, a little carved thing, paint half worn off, that went everywhere in her coat pocket, because I'd seen the shape of it and once, only once, seen her take it out and hold it when she thought no one was near. And I knew that autumn that with her grandmother gone she'd stopped even leaning in. There was no one left to lean toward. She'd fold up smaller each day. At meals she'd sit and look at nothing. On her walks in the walled garden she was allowed one a day, with 2 of us trailing behind. She'd drift along the gravel like a leaf on water, going wherever the path went, caring about none of it. I remember one afternoon in particular. It was a gray day, spitting rain, and she was doing her walk. Corporal Witt was the senior man. I was 2 paces back and to the left, which is where the junior stands. We went round the long way, past the old fountain that hadn't run in years. And the little princess stopped. She stopped at the fountain and she looked down into the empty basin. There were dead leaves in it and a bit of standing rainwater, and I don't know what she saw there. But she stood so long that Corporal Witt shifted his weight and cleared his throat, the polite guard's way of saying, "Keep moving, please." She didn't move. And then, I'll never forget this, she reached into her coat and took out the little wooden horse, and she held it out over the empty basin, just held it there, like she was going to drop it in, like she was going to let the last thing go. I don't know what came over me. It wasn't my place. The junior man does not speak. The junior man is furniture. But I heard myself say, very quietly, "That's a fine horse, Your Highness." Corporal Witt's head snapped round at me like I'd fired a pistol. And the little princess, she looked up. At me. For the first time in all those months, those dark eyes came up off the ground and landed on my face. And she looked at me for a long, long moment, this small silent child in the drizzle, and I felt like I'd been caught doing something far worse than speaking out of turn. I felt like I'd been seen back. She didn't say anything, of course. But she put the horse away, back in her pocket. She didn't drop it. And then she walked on. Corporal Witt gave me the roasting of my life once we were off shift. Rightly so. You don't speak to the principal. You especially don't speak to a grieving royal child about her toys. I said yes, Corporal, and no, Corporal, and won't happen again, Corporal, and I meant it. But that night I lay awake in the guardhouse thinking about the way she'd looked up, and thinking that a child who was about to let go of the last thing she loved had, for whatever daft reason, decided not to. Because a wall said her horse was fine. I'm not telling you I was anything special. I want to be clear about that. I was a nobody. But sometimes the person who catches the falling thing isn't the strongest or the wisest. It's just whoever happens to be standing there. I happened to be standing there. The news from Thornwick got worse. You could measure it by the messengers. Early on there'd be one rider a day bringing word back to the court. Then it was two. Then that second week, riders were coming in at all hours, mud to the knees, and the household steward, a stiff man named Aldous Crane, started walking about with a face like a closed door. I put pieces together the way you do. A word here, a look there. The Dowager Queen wasn't getting better. The fever had gone into her chest. The physicians out at Thornwick had, in the language people use, made her comfortable, which is the phrase they reach for when they've stopped trying to make her well. And nobody told the child. That's the part that started to work on me. Nobody told her. There was a whole conversation about it among the senior household. I caught the tail of it, standing my post outside the steward's office, doing my furniture impression. Some said the princess had a right to know. Others said she was too fragile, that the shock might break what little was left of her, that it was kinder to keep her calm and let things take their course. The kind ones won. It usually goes that way. Kindness that's really just fear of a hard conversation. So Princess Leora went on with her days not knowing that her grandmother, the one person, the last person, was dying an hour and a half up the road. She knew something, though. Children always know. She may not have had the words for it, but she felt the change in the house the way animals feel a storm coming. She stopped doing even the little she'd been doing. She stopped her garden walks. She sat in the window seat, their window seat, hers and the grandmother's, and she looked down the drive where the carriage had gone, and she waited. Every day, in that seat, watching a road that had nothing on it. I was posted to that corridor more than once that week, and every time I passed the doorway I'd see her there, small against the big gray window, and something in my chest would go tight. I want to tell you I was a professional about it. I mostly was. I stood my posts. I said nothing. I did my job. But I'd started to hate the job a little. The storm came in on a Thursday. I remember it was Thursday because Thursday was the day the fish came up from the coast for the kitchens, and the fish cart got stuck in the mud on the low road, and there was a great fuss about it. Small things. You remember the small things around a big one. The sky had been building all day. That heavy iron color it gets before real weather. By the afternoon, the wind had picked up off the sea and the old pines around Kingsmere were roaring, a huge restless sound. And by evening the rain had come, not the polite Hollandcrest drizzle but the real thing, driving in sideways, rattling the tall windows like it wanted in. I came on for the night watch at 8. Miserable weather for it. The kind of night where you pity the man on the outer wall and thank your luck you're inside. I drew an inside post that night as it happened. The east corridor, upper floor, quiet duty, long stretch of hallway, a few doors, one of them the princess's. Corporal Witt had the far end, I had the near. And I settled in for a long, dull, wet night. It was not a long, dull night. Around 11, I heard the horse. You have to understand what that means, on a night like that. No one rides in weather like that unless something is wrong. A sane man waits for morning. A sane man doesn't put a horse's legs at risk on a flooded road in the dark for the sake of a message that could keep. But I heard hooves, fast ones, coming up the drive at a gallop, the sound cutting through even that roaring wind, and my whole body went cold before my mind even caught up. I knew, somehow I knew before I knew anything. I couldn't leave my post to look. So I stood there and I listened, and I heard the horse pull up hard in the courtyard below, and I heard a man's voice shouting for the steward, shouting to be let in, and I heard doors banging and feet running down in the entrance hall. And then I heard the thing I'll hear till I die. Up in the east corridor at my end, the door of the princess's room opened. She'd heard it too. Of course she had. She'd been listening to that drive for a week. She knew the sound of a horse on it better than any of us. Princess Leora came out into the corridor in her nightgown, barefoot on the cold floor, her dark hair loose, and she stood there in the doorway looking down the hall toward the noise, toward the stairs, toward the running feet and the shouting. And her face. I'd never seen anything on that face before. It had always been so still, so closed, but now there was something on it, wide open, terrible, and I understood it at once because I'd have felt the same in her place. Hope and terror, the exact same thing wearing the same face. She looked at me. She looked right at me, this tiny barefoot child in the dark corridor with the storm slamming the windows, and she didn't say a word. She couldn't, or she wouldn't, but her eyes asked me the only question in the world. Is it about her? And God help me, I didn't know what to do. I was the junior man on an inside post. My orders were clear: stay at your station. Do not leave your post. Do not engage the principal. Send the child back to her room and let the household handle the household's business. That's what I was supposed to do. Down below, the shouting had dropped. That's a bad sound when shouting drops. When urgent voices suddenly go low and careful, it means the news has landed. It means people are deciding how to say a terrible thing. I looked at that child in the doorway. And I made a choice. Let me tell you about the choice, because it's the whole hinge of the night, and I've turned it over 10,000 times since. The right thing, the correct thing, the thing the rules were written for, was to send her back to bed. To say, "Everything's fine, Your Highness, back to your room now." And to stand my post while the grown men downstairs decided what a 9-year-old should be told and when. I'd seen how that decision went. I'd watched it go all week. They'd keep her calm. They'd keep her in the dark. They'd protect her right up until it was too late to protect her from the only thing that mattered. And I thought about the window seat, and the empty road she'd watched every day, and the little wooden horse she'd almost let fall. And I thought, no, not like this. Not a child finding out the worst thing in the world from a closed door and a stranger's downcast eyes an hour after it was decided she shouldn't know. I didn't have a plan. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't a hero riding to the rescue. I was a scared young man in a wet corridor who couldn't stand the look on a little girl's face. I left my post. I walked down the corridor toward her slow, so I wouldn't frighten her, and I got down on one knee so my eyes were level with hers, the way you do with a small child, and I still didn't know what I was going to say. Then I heard the feet on the stairs. Coming up, heavy and quick. The steward, Crane, and behind him a physician, and behind them the rider still in his soaked coat, and they came up into the east corridor and stopped dead when they saw me down on one knee in front of the princess. Crane's face did something complicated, anger and relief and grief all at once. "Guardsman," he said low, "step away. This is a household matter." And Princess Leora's hand closed on my sleeve. I felt it before I saw it. This small, cold hand, gripping the wool of my sleeve hard. She'd reached out and taken hold of me, and she was holding on like I was the last solid thing in a flood. She didn't look at Crane, she didn't look at the physician, she looked at me. And her grip said what her mouth wouldn't: "Don't go, don't leave me with them, you." I looked up at Crane. "Sir," I said, "she has a right to be told properly, by someone who'll—" I didn't have the word, by someone. He looked at me for a long moment. He was not a warm man, Crane, but he wasn't a stupid one, and he wasn't cruel. He looked at the child's hand fisted in my sleeve, and he looked at her face, and I watched him lose the argument with himself the same way I'd lost it. "The Dowager Queen," he said very quietly to me, not to her, to me, but loud enough that she'd hear because he wasn't a coward either, "has taken a hard turn tonight. The physicians at Thornwick believe," his voice caught just slightly, "they believe she has very little time. She has been asking for the princess, by name, over and over. She wants the child brought to her." The rider spoke up then, hoarse, water dripping off him onto the floor. "She keeps calling for her, sir, won't settle. Keeps saying the little one's name and asking, is she coming?" I rode straight through. The road's bad, but it's passable if you go now. If you wait for morning, he stopped. He didn't finish it. He didn't have to. And there it was, the whole shape of the night laid out in that cold corridor. The grandmother was dying, and she was dying calling for the child. And the child was here, an hour and a half of black flooded road away, and the only question left in the world was whether anyone would be brave enough or fast enough to close that distance in time. I felt the small hand tighten on my sleeve. I looked down at her. She'd understood every word. Of course she had. Children understand far more than we let ourselves believe, and her face wasn't blank now. It was cracked wide open, and behind the crack was a 9-year-old who had already lost her mother and was being asked to lose the last one too, and who could not even scream about it because somewhere along the way she'd forgotten how to make a sound. But she looked at me, and she pointed, down the corridor, toward the stairs, toward the door, toward the road. She didn't need words. She was saying, "Take me to her." Now here's where it should have all fallen apart, and it nearly did. Because a physician started talking about the danger. The weather, the roads, the shock to the child, the impropriety of it, the hour. All true, every word. It was a mad thing to put a grieving 9-year-old in a carriage in the worst storm of the autumn, to race an hour and a half through the dark on the chance she'd arrive before an old woman stopped breathing. Sensible, he was being sensible. Sensible is what kills people sometimes. Sensible is the thing that keeps you standing safe on the near bank while the person you love goes under on the far one. And I lost my temper. I didn't shout. You don't shout in the uniform, even off the leash. But I stood up, and I looked at that physician, and I said something I had no right to say to a man 3 ranks above my station. "With respect, sir, if it were your mother up that road, calling your name, would you be standing here talking about the weather?" The corridor went silent, just the storm hammering the windows. Crane looked at me, and I saw the thing turn in him. He was old enough to have a mother in a grave somewhere. He knew exactly what I meant. "Get a carriage," he said, not to me, to the household man hovering at the top of the stairs. "The light one, the fast one, best horses, now, and get someone to dress the princess warm." He turned to me and his voice changed, got harder, got official. "Guardsman, what's your name?" "Halloran, sir, Elias Halloran." "Halloran," he studied me. "You've broken about 4 standing orders in the last 5 minutes." "Yes, sir." "You'll ride with her, in the carriage. If we're doing this insane thing, the child doesn't ride it with strangers." He looked down at Leora, at her hand still fixed in my sleeve, and something in his stiff old face softened for just a second. "She's chosen you, it seems. God knows why. Don't make me regret it." "No, sir, I won't." And that was how I came to be sitting in a lurching carriage at 11:30 at night. In a storm you wouldn't send a dog out in, with a silent princess's small cold hand still gripping my sleeve, racing a road toward a dying old woman. I'll never forget that carriage ride as long as I live. The rain came down so hard you couldn't see the lead horses from the window. The lamps threw a weak yellow smear on the water and the mud, and the wheels slewed and jumped over ruts you couldn't see coming, and every so often we'd hit a stretch of flooded road, and the whole carriage would drag and shudder like it might just sink into the earth. The driver was a good man. I never learned his name. He drove like the road owed him money. He pushed those horses right up to the edge of what was safe and held them there, mile after black mile, because he understood, everyone in that carriage understood, that we were racing something that doesn't slow down and doesn't negotiate. And beside me sat the princess. Someone had wrapped her in a heavy traveling cloak, too big for her, so she was mostly a small pale face inside a mountain of dark wool. She sat rigid, staring straight ahead, and she never let go of my sleeve. Not once. Not for the whole ride. Every jolt of the carriage, that little grip tightened. I didn't know what to say to her. "What do you say?" So mostly I said nothing. I just let her hold on. But once, when we hit a bad patch and the carriage nearly went over and she flinched hard against me, I did something I'd never have dared any other night. I put my arm around her. I know how that sounds. A guardsman. A child not his to touch. Every rule I had says you keep your distance. But she was shaking, not crying, still not crying, but shaking, this deep silent tremor running through her whole small body, and I couldn't sit there like furniture while a child shook apart beside me. So I put my arm around her shoulders, over the big cloak, and I held her steady against the lurching of the carriage, and I said the only thing I could think of, low, under the noise of the storm. "We're going to get you there," I said. "You hear me? I don't care what this road does. I'll carry you the last mile on my own back if I have to. We're going to get you to her." She didn't answer. I didn't expect her to. But she turned her face into my shoulder, into the wet wool of my coat, and she stayed there. And the shaking eased, just a little, just enough. And I made her a promise in my own head, sitting in that carriage. I promised that whatever happened at the end of that road, this child would not arrive too late, not while I had legs to run on. I had no right to make that promise. It wasn't mine to keep. The road would decide, and the horses, and the old woman's failing heart, none of which cared what a young guardsman swore in the dark. But I made it anyway. Sometimes a promise you have no right to make is the only thing holding you together. We lost time twice. Once at a ford where the water had come up over the road, and the driver had to walk the horses through slow, feeling for the edges, the whole carriage tilting in the current, all of us silent and praying. That cost us 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like a year. And once when a fallen branch, half a tree really, brought down by the wind, blocked the low road entirely, and the driver and I had to get out into the full fury of the storm and drag it clear by hand. I was soaked to the skin in about 4 seconds. The rain wasn't cold so much as hard, like being hit. We hauled that wet dead weight off the road with the wind screaming in our ears, and the whole time I could see the pale, small face of the princess watching us through the streaming carriage window, and I thought, not because of a tree. We do not lose her because of a tree. We got it clear, we got back in, we drove on. And somewhere in the last stretch, the storm began not to stop. It didn't stop for hours yet, but to thin. The rain lightened from a wall to a downpour to something you could see through, and through it at last I saw lights. Thornwick. An old gray house on a low rise, every window lit, which on a dying night means people are awake in every room, which means the household is holding its breath the same way we were. The carriage came up the drive, and the lights got bigger, and the driver hauled the horses down, and we stopped, at last, at the foot of the steps. And I knew the moment we stopped that we were close, not close to safe, close to too late. There was a woman waiting at the top of the steps with a lamp. A nurse, I think, or a housekeeper. And the look on her face when she saw the carriage, the relief and the fear all mixed, the exact same look I'd seen on the child's face in the corridor hours before, told me everything. We were in time, barely, maybe. The nurse called down through the rain, and her voice broke on it. "Is she here? Is the child here? Oh, thank God, quick, come quick. She's still with us, but you must come now, come now." And that's when I ran. I want to describe this part exactly, because it's the part I told you about at the very start. The night I broke every rule. This is the heart of it. The carriage had barely stopped. The proper thing, the dignified thing, would have been for the door to be opened, for the princess to be helped down, for us to proceed up the steps in good order. There was no time for good order. I threw open the carriage door, and I gathered the princess up out of her mountain of wet wool. She came into my arms without a sound, light as a bundle of sticks, her arms going round my neck, and I went up those stone steps 2 at a time in the streaming rain, boots slipping, one arm under her and one hand out for the rail, past the nurse, into the house. "Which room?" I said, "Which room?" The nurse ran ahead of me, lamp swinging, and I followed her up a staircase and down a long dim hall lined with old portraits that watched us go by. and at the end of it a door stood open, and warm yellow light spilled out of it, and I could hear, even from the hall, a thin voice inside, an old cracked voice, saying the same thing over and over, saying the child's name. "Leora, where is my Leora? Bring me my Leora." The princess heard it. I felt her whole body go rigid in my arms and then strain forward, toward the sound, toward the door, and she made, for the first time in all those months, she made a sound. Not a word. Just a small broken cry, high in her throat, the sound a child makes reaching for someone. I carried her through the door. The room was small and warm, and full of the smell of medicine and beeswax and old wood smoke. There was a fire in the grate burned low. There were 2 physicians and another nurse, all of whom looked up when I came crashing in, soaked to the bone, a princess in my arms, and none of whom said a word about it, because past a certain point on a night like that, nobody cares about the rules anymore. Everyone in that room had stopped caring about anything except the old woman in the bed. And there she was, the Dowager Queen Adelheid, propped up on a mountain of pillows, so thin, so small, this woman I'd only ever seen straight-backed and formidable, cane in hand, now barely a shape under the blankets. Her white hair was loose on the pillow. Her breath came in slow drags you could hear across the room. Her eyes were half shut and her hands moved a little on the coverlet, restless, searching. And her cracked voice was still going, softer now, running down like a clock. "Leora, where is my little one? Bring her. Bring my Leora to me." I crossed to the bed. I set the child down on it gently, right beside her grandmother, and I stepped back. And I watched the 2 of them find each other. The old woman's searching hand touched the child's arm, and her eyes came open. And for a moment they were clear, bright, present, hers, clear the way a candle sometimes flares up bright just before it goes. "There you are," she breathed. "Oh, there you are, my girl, my silent girl, you came." The princess pressed herself against her grandmother's side, into the exact place she used to sit in the window seat at Kingsmere, and she buried her face against the old woman's shoulder, and she held on. And the Dowager Queen wrapped one thin arm around her and closed her eyes and let out a long breath, and every line of pain in her face eased all at once, like a hand let go of a fist. "There now," she murmured into the child's hair. "There now, I've got you. I've got you, my darling, don't be afraid. I want to tell you the old woman got better, that the child's coming worked some miracle and she rallied and lived years more. I told you at the start I'd give you the whole of it, so I won't lie to you now. She didn't get better. You don't get better from what she had. All the child's coming did, all any of it did, was let her go easy instead of hard. Let her go with the one thing she'd been calling for held safe in her arms. But I have lived a long time now, and I have come to believe that is not a small thing. That is very nearly everything. The difference between dying alone calling a name and dying with the answer to that name held against your heart, that is a distance worth racing any road for, worth breaking any rule for. I stepped back into the corner and I stood there dripping on the floor, and I did the thing I was trained to do, which was disappear, be furniture, give them the room. They had a little time, not much, a quarter of an hour maybe. The grandmother talked low and slow to the child. I couldn't hear most of it and I didn't try, it wasn't mine. But I heard some. She told the child she loved her. She told the child that the silence was all right, that she understood the silence, that some grief is too big for words and that was nothing to be ashamed of. She told the child that her mother had loved her, and that she, the grandmother, had loved her, and that being loved like that doesn't stop when a person stops. That it stays, that it soaks into you and becomes part of what you're made of, and you carry it forward whether you can speak of it or not. "You're not empty," I heard her say. "Everyone thinks you're empty because you're quiet. You're not empty, my darling, you're full. You're so full it stopped up your throat. One day it'll come loose again. And when it does," her voice was going now, thinning out, "when it does, you tell them about me. You tell them your grandmother loved you more than the whole gray sea." And the child nodded against her shoulder, I saw her nod. The old woman's eyes found me then, over the child's head, across the room, this dripping young guardsman in the corner who'd carried her granddaughter up the steps. "You," she said, "not a question, you brought her." "Yes, ma'am," I said. My voice came out rough. "In this weather, on this road." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at me a long moment, and then she said something I've carried for the rest of my life. She said, "Then you're not a wall, whatever they've told you. A wall keeps things out. You," her breath dragged, "you let something through. Remember that." I couldn't answer. I just bowed my head. She smiled, faintly, and she turned her face back to the child and gathered her in a little closer, and she didn't say anything else after that. She went quiet somewhere in the small hours, so gently that for a while none of us were quite sure it had happened. One breath just didn't lead to the next. The child lay against her, and the fire burned down, and the storm eased off outside, and the old woman slipped away with her granddaughter in her arms, exactly the way she'd wanted, exactly the way she'd called for. I carried the princess out when it was time. She wouldn't be parted from her grandmother's side, and I didn't force her. I let the nurses and the physicians do their gentle work while she stayed, until at last it was truly time, and then I gathered her up again. She'd fallen into that stunned half-sleep that grief drops children into, and I carried her down the long hall past the portraits, and out to a room where a fire had been lit and a bed made ready. I sat with her the rest of that night. I know I had no orders to. By then I'd stopped counting the orders I'd broken. Nobody sent me away. I think, by that point, everyone understood that this small, silent child had chosen exactly one person to hold on to in the worst night of her young life, and that it would be a cruelty to pry her loose from him now. So I sat in a chair by the bed, still in my damp uniform, and I watched over her while she slept, the way I'd watched over her door 100 nights when she was only a duty and not, whatever she'd become, a person I'd carried through a storm, a person whose grandmother's last words to me were, "You let something through." Toward dawn she woke. She woke the way children do, all at once, eyes open. And for a second I saw her remember where she was and what had happened, and I braced for the tears finally at last. But she didn't cry. She looked at me, sitting there in the gray early light keeping watch over her. And she looked at me a long time, the way she had that first day at the empty fountain, seeing me back. And then she spoke. The first words I ever heard her say. The first words I later learned that anyone had heard her say in over a year. She said very quietly, very hoarse, like a voice remembering how, "You kept your promise." I couldn't speak. I'd made her that promise in a lurching carriage in the dark, and I'd never dreamed she'd remembered it, let alone that it would be the thing to break a year's silence. "I did," I managed. "I always will, whatever you need, as long as I'm standing anywhere near you." And she nodded slow, like something in her had been decided. Then she said the second thing. And this is the line I've never told anyone, the reason I'm telling you any of this at all, because a man shouldn't take a thing like this all the way to his grave without letting it out into the world at least once. She told me I'm full, not empty, full. "You are," I said. She was right about you." And the princess, this child who'd stood over an empty fountain ready to let the last thing fall, who'd watched an empty road for a week, who'd forgotten how to make a sound. The princess reached into the pocket of the nightgown they'd never changed her out of, and she took out the little wooden horse, paint half worn off, and she looked at it. And she didn't let it fall. She held it, and then she held it out to me, not to give it away, I understood, but to show me, and she said, this was hers first. She gave it to my mother. My mother gave it to me. 3 generations in a scrap of carved wood the size of a plum. All that love soaked in, carried forward. You're not empty, you're full. Then you keep it very safe, I said. I will, she said. And she put it back in her pocket, where it belonged. I served the crown of Hollencrest for 30 more years after that night. I stood a great many posts. I met a great many people. Most of them I've forgotten. If I'm honest, the years blur at my age into one long gray watch. But I never forgot that child, and she, it turned out, never forgot me. She grew up. She found her voice again slowly that year, then all at once, the way the grandmother said she would. By the time she was a young woman, she was known across the kingdom for it, for the way she spoke, for the way she saw people who were used to not being seen. The silent princess, they'd called her once. They stopped calling her that. They called her other things, later, kinder things, true things. And every so often down the years, on some gray day, I'd be standing my post somewhere and I'd feel eyes on me, and I'd glance carefully, the way you do, not moving your head, and it would be her. Grown, passing through on some errand of state, and she'd catch my eye across a courtyard, across a hall, and she'd give me the smallest nod. You kept your promise. I never told anyone what that nod meant. It wasn't theirs to know. It was ours. People ask me sometimes, the young ones, the new guardsmen, when they find out how long I served, what the job's really about, what it takes. They expect me to talk about standing still, about discipline, about the cold and the long hours and the not moving a muscle while a tourist shouts in your face. And all that's true, that's most of it day to day. But it's not the heart of it. Here's the heart of it, and it's the only wisdom I've got. And I got it from a dying old woman in a warm little room at the end of a terrible road. They train you to be a wall. And most days, that's right, most days the job is to keep the bad things out, to stand between the thing you guard and the thing that would harm it, still and silent and strong. But every so often, once or twice in a whole life if you're paying attention, the job asks you for the opposite. It asks you to stop being a wall and let something through, to break the rule instead of keeping it, to carry the child up the steps in the rain, to reach the falling thing before it falls. And on those nights, the ones that matter, the ones you carry to your grave, the good guardsman isn't the one who stood perfectly still. It's the one who knew when to run. I was standing there, so I ran. And I have never once, in all the years since, been sorry.